My husband died 6 months ago, but yesterday I saw him alive at a store. I followed him. He got into a car with another woman. She called him husband. When I walked up to them and knocked on the window, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Ellen Calloway. I'm 67 years old, and I've lived in the same house in Denton, Texas for 41 years. The oak tree in the backyard, the one Gerald planted the summer our daughter Karen was born, is still there. It's taller than the roof now. I used to sit under it with my morning coffee and think that some things in life are permanent. The tree, the house, my marriage. I was wrong about the last one. Gerald and I were married for 38 years. 38 years of Sunday dinners and arguments about the thermostat, and vacations to the same lake house in Arkansas every August. We had 2 children, Karen and our son Thomas, and 4 grandchildren between them. We had a retirement plan, a joint savings account, and a life insurance policy worth $400,000 that Gerald had insisted on taking out 10 years ago. "For your peace of mind, Maggie," he'd said, "in case anything happens to me." He was always very careful about that policy. I should have asked myself why. Instead, I believed him. I believed everything. When he started coming home late from his job at the property management company, I told myself it was the Henderson account, a large commercial property that had been giving him trouble for months. When he began sleeping on the far edge of the bed, turned away from me like a man guarding something private, I told myself it was his back. Gerald had always had a bad back. When he started taking his phone into the bathroom, something he'd never done in 38 years of marriage, I told myself he was watching those football highlight videos that Thomas had shown him how to find on YouTube. I told myself a great many things. There were smaller signs, too, ones I cataloged only later, in the terrible silence after. He had lost weight, perhaps 20 pounds over the course of a year, weight that made him look younger, sharper. He had bought new clothes that didn't look like Gerald at all. Fitted shirts, dark jeans, shoes that weren't the beaten New Balance sneakers he'd worn since Obama's first term. He had started going to the gym, which he called the doctor's orders, after a routine physical. He had changed the password on his laptop. But I was 66 years old and I was tired, and it is very easy when you are tired to choose the explanation that requires the least from you. Then, in February of last year, Gerald had a heart attack. That's what they told me. That's what the death certificate said. He collapsed at work, alone in his office on a Friday afternoon when his assistant had already left for the weekend. By the time anyone found him, it was too late. The paramedics, the hospital, the doctor who spoke to me in that small beige room, they all said the same thing. Massive myocardial infarction. He would not have suffered long. I buried an empty casket. The funeral director had gently explained that the condition of the body made an open casket inadvisable. I had been too destroyed to question it. I collected the life insurance. $412,000 after processing fees. I gave a portion to Karen and Thomas. I sat under the oak tree and cried until I had no more tears left, and then I cried some more. For 6 months, I grieved. And then, on a Tuesday morning in August, a bright, indifferent morning that smelled of cut grass and coming rain, I drove to the Kroger on Elm Street to buy milk, eggs, and the specific brand of herbal tea that helps me sleep. I was in the cereal aisle when I saw him. He was heavier than I remembered, or perhaps the fitted shirt made him look that way. His hair was different, shorter, with a trace of gray that I didn't recognize. He was pushing a cart, studying the back of a box of granola with the focused, slightly squinting expression I had watched him make 10,000 times over 38 years. the expression he made when he was reading without his glasses. I stopped walking. The box of tea I was holding fell to the floor. He didn't look up. He set the granola in his cart and pushed it forward and rounded the corner toward the dairy section, and I stood very still in the cereal aisle of the Kroger on Elm Street, in the town where we had lived together for 4 decades, watching my dead husband do his grocery shopping. I followed him. I don't remember making the decision. I remember that my legs moved and that the fluorescent lights above me seemed very bright and that I could hear my own breathing. He moved through the store at a comfortable pace, unhurried, pausing to add items to his cart. He looked healthy. He looked rested. He looked, I realized, with a sickness that started in my stomach and spread outward like cold water. Happy. He paid at the self-checkout and walked out into the parking lot. I followed him through the sliding doors into the August heat. A silver Honda Accord was parked in the 3rd row. A woman was sitting in the passenger seat, younger than me by perhaps 15 years, with dark hair pulled back from her face. When Gerald reached the car and opened the trunk to load his bags, she rolled down her window and said something. She was smiling. I was close enough, in that flat, carrying Texas heat, to hear exactly what she said. She said, "Did you get the good granola, husband?" And Gerald laughed. He laughed the way he used to laugh with me. Easy, comfortable, like a man entirely at home in his life. I was standing 12 feet away. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped my purse. The sound made him turn. For one moment, one long, stretched, terrible moment, Gerald Calloway looked directly at me. His face went white. And then I walked to that car and I knocked on the window, and the world as I had understood it for 67 years came apart at the seams. He didn't run. I think I had expected him to run. Instead, Gerald stood very still beside the open trunk of that silver Honda, his grocery bags at his feet, and looked at me the way a man looks at something he has spent a great deal of energy pretending does not exist. The color had drained from his face completely. I could see the pulse in his throat. I had kissed that throat 10,000 times. I had pressed my ear against that chest and listened to the heart that was supposedly dead. The woman, his wife, had gotten out of the car by then. She was perhaps 50, slim, with the kind of careful, maintained appearance that speaks of effort and intention. She wore a yellow blouse. I remember the yellow blouse very clearly. She looked from Gerald to me and back to Gerald with an expression that shifted in the space of 3 seconds from confusion to something I can only describe as calculation. "Gerald," she said. Her voice was calm, too calm. He said my name. Just that, Maggie, in a voice so low it was almost nothing. "You're dead," I said. It came out very flat, very ordinary, the way you might say it's raining or the mail is here. "I buried you. I have a death certificate. I watched them put your casket in the ground at Westland Cemetery on February the 19th. He opened his mouth. He closed it again. The woman in the yellow blouse stepped forward and touched his arm. It was a proprietary gesture, the unconscious movement of someone who is accustomed to ownership, and it hit me somewhere behind my sternum like a physical blow. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said. I looked at her. I looked at her for a long time. Then I turned around and walked back to my car. I drove home. I don't know how. I don't remember traffic lights or turns or parking in the driveway. I remember sitting in the car for a long time after the engine was off, looking at the front door of my house, at the potted geraniums on the porch steps that I had planted in the spring because planting things had felt like an act of faith, a declaration that I intended to continue living. I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Gerald and I had eaten 38 years of meals. And I put my hands flat on the wood, and I breathed. Then I started to count. $412,000. That was what the insurance company had paid me. And what I now understood was not a death benefit, but stolen money. Money obtained through fraud, through the faking of a death, through the deliberate and calculated destruction of my life and the lives of my children. I had given Karen $80,000 of it, which she had used as a down payment on a house. I had given Thomas $60,000, which he had invested. The remainder sat in my savings account, where I had been drawing it down slowly, carefully, the way you do when you believe it is the last money your husband will ever earn. But the money was only part of it. 38 years. 38 years of a life I now had to re-examine from the beginning, looking for the seams, the places where the real story showed through the one I had been told. How long had he been planning this? How long had the woman in the yellow blouse been a part of his life? How long had I been sleeping beside a man who was rehearsing his own disappearance? I thought about Karen and Thomas. They had grieved. They had stood at a graveside in February cold and wept for their father. Thomas had taken 2 weeks off work. Karen had driven 4 hours from Houston and slept in the guest bedroom for 10 days, sitting with me in the evenings and holding my hand. They had grieved for something that was not real, for a death that had been manufactured, for a father who had looked at his children's love and decided it was worth less than a clean start. The anger, when it came, was very quiet. That surprised me. I had expected something loud and shattering, the kind of anger that breaks dishes and says words you can't take back. What I felt instead was a cold, clear, steady thing, like a flame that burns without flickering, because there is no wind left to disturb it. I was not going to cry. I had already given 6 months of tears to a fiction. I went to my bedroom and I opened the box on the top shelf of my closet where I keep important papers. The box Gerald had always teased me about, calling me the family archivist. Inside it, our marriage certificate, the deed to the house in both our names, his life insurance policy, the death certificate, medical records from the hospital. I spread them on the bed and I looked at them for a long time. Then I did the thing that Gerald had clearly never believed I would do. He had always underestimated me. In 38 years, that had been his single most consistent mistake. I picked up the phone and I called my daughter. "Karen," I said, when she answered, "I need you to come to Denton. Don't bring the children, and don't tell your brother yet. I need to talk to you first." I paused. "I saw your father today." The silence on the other end of the line lasted 4 full seconds. "Mom," she said finally, "what do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said." I looked out the kitchen window at the oak tree in the yard, at the late afternoon light moving through its branches. "He's alive, Karen. Your father is alive. And I am going to need a lawyer." That was the moment I stopped being a grieving widow. That was the moment I became something else entirely. Karen arrived the next morning. She drove through the night, and when I opened the front door at 6:15 a.m., she looked the way I felt. Hollowed out. Running on something grimmer and more durable than sleep. She was 41 years old, my daughter, with Gerald's eyes and my stubbornness, and she stood on the porch with her overnight bag and looked at me for a long moment before she stepped inside and put her arms around me. We didn't speak for almost a minute. "Tell me everything," she said finally at the kitchen table, with coffee in front of both of us. I told her. I told her about the cereal aisle and the granola and the silver Honda and the woman in the yellow blouse. I told her about the 12 feet of parking lot between us and the sound of that woman's voice saying, "Husband." I told her about Gerald's face going white and the way he had said my name, not with guilt, not with remorse, but with the stunned, almost offended expression of a man whose careful plan has been inconvenienced. Karen's hands wrapped around her coffee mug were absolutely still. "The insurance money," she said. "Yes." She set the mug down. "Mom, what he did, what you're describing, that's not just leaving someone. That's criminal. That's insurance fraud. That's—" "I know what it is," I said. "That's why I need a lawyer." His name was Robert Delaney. Karen found him. She had a colleague who had used him in a contentious divorce, and Karen had always been efficient in a crisis, had always been the child who responded to emergency by making lists. Robert Delaney was 55, with an office in downtown Denton, and a reputation, Karen's colleague said, for being methodical and entirely without sentimentality. Those were exactly the qualities I required. We met with him that same afternoon. I brought the box, the marriage certificate, the insurance policy, the death certificate, the medical records, all of it. I sat across from Robert Delaney's desk and I laid it out clearly. Everything I had seen, everything I suspected, everything I knew. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "if what you're describing is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt you, your husband has committed insurance fraud, identity fraud, and potentially conspiracy. The insurance company will want to be involved. The FBI handles insurance fraud cases of this scale." He paused. "I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. Are you prepared for what this means? For your family? For your children?" I thought about Thomas, who still didn't know. I thought about the 4 grandchildren who called Gerald Grandpa Jerry and had cried at his funeral. "I'm prepared," I said. "Then let's begin." What followed was 2 weeks of careful, quiet work. The kind that happens in offices and on phone calls and in paper trails, invisible from the outside, devastating in its accumulation. Robert contacted the insurance company first. A man named David Park, a senior investigator for the company, came to Denton within 48 hours of Robert's call. He sat in my living room and asked me questions for 2 hours, and his expression, which began as professionally neutral, shifted gradually into something that looked like controlled outrage. "We paid this claim 8 months ago," he said, at one point, almost to himself. "I know," I said. "Gerald always was good with timing." Meanwhile, Robert hired a private investigator named Sheila Voss. Sheila was a small, quiet woman in her late 40s who dressed like she was going to a PTA meeting and moved through the world with a kind of absolute, unassuming invisibility that I came to understand was her greatest professional asset. Within 4 days, Sheila had located Gerald. He and the woman in the yellow blouse, her name, Sheila informed me, was Diane Mercer, were living in a rented house in Frisco, 30 miles from Denton. Gerald was working under the name Gerald Cole, his mother's maiden name, at a small property management firm, a career so similar to his previous one that it struck me as almost contemptuous in its lack of imagination. Diane Mercer had a Texas driver's license listing her occupation as a real estate agent. They had been together, based on what Sheila had uncovered, for at least 3 years. 3 years. Our marriage had still had 3 years left in it when he had begun building the life he intended to replace it with. I was sitting at the kitchen table when Sheila delivered her preliminary report in person, photographs included. Karen was there. Robert Delaney was on the phone. I looked at the photographs. Gerald coming out of a Starbucks. Gerald mowing the lawn of a house that was not mine. Gerald and Diane at what appeared to be a neighborhood barbecue. laughing with people who knew him as someone who had never had a wife of 38 years, had never stood at an altar in a church in Denton, Texas, had never planted an oak tree in a backyard for a daughter who was now sitting across from me with her hands balled into fists. "Is this enough?" I asked Robert. "This, combined with what the insurance investigator has," he said, "is more than enough to refer to the FBI." I looked at the photograph of Gerald laughing at the barbecue. He was holding a beer. He looked, I thought again, genuinely happy, as though no one had been hurt, as though the happiness were free. "Then refer it," I said. I didn't know yet that Sheila's car had been noticed, parked twice near their street. I didn't know that Diane, who was sharper than Gerald had ever been, had written down Sheila's license plate. But I would find out very soon. The FBI field office in Dallas assigned the case to a special agent named Patricia Horton. She called me on a Wednesday morning, 12 days after I had knocked on the window of that silver Honda. And her voice was the voice of a woman who has heard many things and is not easily surprised by any of them. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "I've reviewed the materials forwarded by your attorney and by the insurance investigator. I'd like to meet with you in person." We met in Robert Delaney's office that Friday. Agent Horton was perhaps 45, with short gray hair and the particular quality of attention that I have since come to associate with people who are very good at their jobs. A stillness, a focus, the sense that nothing you say will be lost or mischaracterized. She asked careful questions. She looked at everything I had brought. "I want to be straightforward with you," she said, before she left. "This investigation will take time. These cases require building a complete evidentiary picture. I need you to be patient, and I need you to continue living your life as normally as possible. Don't confront him. Don't contact him. Let us work." I told her I understood. I meant it. What I had not accounted for, what none of us had fully accounted for, was Diane Mercer. She called me 4 days later. My personal cell phone, a number she should not have had. I answered because I didn't recognize the number, and for a half second before she spoke, I thought it might be Agent Horton. "Margaret," she said. Her voice was warm, composed, the voice of a woman who has decided that the best defense is a posture of absolute reasonableness. "I think we need to talk." I said nothing. "I understand you're upset," she continued. "What you saw must have been a terrible shock. But I need you to understand that Gerald left your marriage because he was unhappy. He was deeply unhappy for a very long time. He's a different person now. He's well. He's at peace. Whatever you think you're doing, whatever attorney you've hired, I'm asking you, one woman to another, to consider the consequences for everyone involved. For your children, for your grandchildren." A pause, carefully timed. "For yourself." I let her finish. Then I said very quietly, "Did you know he was married when you met him?" Silence. "Did you know he had children, grandchildren? Did you know he was going to fake his own death and let those grandchildren stand at a graveside and cry?" More silence. "Don't call this number again," I said. "The next conversation you have will be with a federal agent." I hung up. My hands were shaking, but my voice had not shaken once. I was proud of that. They escalated 2 days later. Gerald himself appeared at my door. I saw him through the window, standing on my porch, on the porch where we had sat together on summer evenings, and the sight of him there, solid and living, in the place where I had mourned him, produced in me an emotion so complex that I cannot fully name it even now. There was rage. There was grief. There was, underneath both of those, the remnant of 38 years of love. Not gone, not cleanly gone, but transformed into something that no longer had any warmth in it. I did not open the door. I called Robert Delaney. he called Agent Horton. Within the hour, I had been advised to document the visit and informed that a second visit would constitute grounds for a restraining order. Gerald left after 12 minutes of standing on my porch. I watched him through the window the entire time. He looked older than he had in Sheila's photographs. He looked, I thought, frightened. Good. The following week, a man I didn't recognize sat in a car across the street from my house for 2 hours on a Thursday afternoon. I photographed the car, the license plate, and the man, with the small digital camera that Thomas had given me for Christmas 3 years ago and which I had never used until now. I sent the photographs to Robert and to Agent Horton. The man did not return. That was the moment, I think, that Diane and Gerald understood they had made a serious miscalculation. They had expected a grieving old woman. They had expected someone who could be reasoned with, or frightened, or worn down by the sheer exhaustion of the fight. They had not expected someone who photographed surveillance cars and forwarded the evidence to the FBI. After that, for a short while, they went quiet. And I, on the advice of my attorney and the quiet insistence of my daughter, allowed myself 3 days. Karen took me to San Antonio, somewhere I had not been in years, somewhere without the oak tree and the kitchen table, and the particular weight of a life that had been built in one place and then detonated. We walked along the river walk in the evenings. We ate good food. We sat in the hotel room and watched old movies, and Karen fell asleep with her head on my shoulder the way she had when she was small. On the last morning, I sat on the hotel balcony with my coffee and looked at the river below and thought, I am still here. Whatever he took from me, he did not take this. He did not take me. I went home ready. The offer came through a lawyer, not Robert Delaney. Another lawyer, one I had never heard of, a man named Craig Sutton, who sent a formal letter to Robert's office approximately 3 weeks after San Antonio. The letter was written in the careful, bloodless language of legal correspondence, but its meaning was plain enough. Gerald Calloway, referred to throughout as our client, was prepared to make a financial settlement. The proposed amount was $200,000 to be paid in a lump sum in exchange for my agreement to withdraw my cooperation from the federal investigation, to make no further statements to law enforcement, and to characterize the life insurance claim as a misunderstanding arising from miscommunication between parties. I read the letter twice at Robert's desk. Then I set it down. A misunderstanding, I said. Robert, to his credit, said nothing. He had the good sense to simply wait. He faked his death, I said. He collected $400,000 in fraudulent insurance. He let my children grieve him. He let my grandchildren bury an empty casket. I looked at the letter again. And he's offering me $200,000 to call it a misunderstanding. That is what the letter says, Robert confirmed. What does the FBI say? Agent Horton's position is that your cooperation is voluntary, and that any decision you make is yours to make. She did ask me to note, however, that accepting this offer would not protect your husband from federal prosecution. The insurance company is a separate complainant, and the FBI investigation proceeds regardless of your personal participation. What it would do is remove your testimony from the case. I thought about that. I thought about the weight a jury might give to a wife of 38 years, standing in a federal courtroom, explaining what it had been like to grieve a man who was playing house in Frisco. Tell Craig Sutton no, I said. Tell him that I appreciate the offer and that I decline it entirely, and that if his client contacts me again through any channel, I will be adding harassment to the list of concerns I've shared with Agent Horton. Robert smiled. It was a small smile, brief and professional, but it was there. What I had not fully understood, until the weeks following San Antonio, was how much I needed other people. I am a private woman by nature. Gerald had always been the social one, the one who remembered neighbors' birthdays and organized the block's 4th of July cookout. Without him, I had retreated inward, had let the circle of my daily life contract to the kitchen table and the oak tree and the phone calls with Karen and Thomas. Thomas, by now, knew everything. I had called him the night I returned from San Antonio, and the conversation had been one of the hardest of my life. Not because Thomas fell apart, but because he didn't. He was very still on the phone, the way he goes still when he is containing something large, and then he said, "Mom, tell me what you need." No recriminations, no panic. Just that. It nearly broke me in an entirely different way. But it was my neighbor Dorothy who surprised me most. Dorothy Reeves was 70, a retired schoolteacher who had lived 3 houses down for 20 years, and whom I had always liked without ever quite moving past the level of pleasant neighbor friendliness. She brought me a casserole in the week after Gerald's funeral, and I had thanked her warmly and thought little more of it. But Dorothy had sharp eyes and a long memory, and one morning in September, about a week after my return from San Antonio, she knocked on my door and said simply, "I know something is going on, Margaret. I've known for a while. I'm not going to pry, but I'm here if you need me, and I have very good coffee." I let her in. I told her everything. It took 2 hours and most of her coffee and a box of crackers she found in my cupboard. Dorothy listened the way good teachers listen, without interrupting, without inserting herself, asking only the questions that would help me be more precise. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at me with an expression I recognized. Not pity, not horror, but the clear-eyed, steady regard of someone who is recalculating you upward. "You're handling this right," she said. Those 4 words meant more to me than I would have predicted. Through Dorothy, I was connected to a small group. 4 women, ranging in age from 62 to 74, all of whom had navigated in various ways betrayals and losses, and the specific exhaustion of being underestimated by people who should have known better. We met on Thursday evenings at Dorothy's house, initially for what Dorothy called coffee and complaining, and which gradually became something more substantial. They did not know all the details of my situation. I was careful about what was public and what was not. But they knew enough, and they were, each in their own way, ferociously in my corner. I thought about what Gerald had banked on, an old woman, alone, too frightened and too tired to fight. He had been wrong about the alone, and he had been catastrophically wrong about the tired. They came on a Sunday. I didn't know they were coming. There had been no call, no letter through Craig Sutton's office. Nothing. I was in the backyard that October afternoon, sitting under the oak tree with a cup of tea and a library book I wasn't really reading, when I heard the doorbell. I went around the side of the house, still holding my book, and found them on my porch. Both of them. Gerald was wearing a gray jacket I had never seen. He looked nervous. I could see it in the set of his shoulders, the particular stiffness that had always been his tell in difficult conversations. Diane was beside him, and she was dressed very carefully, neat, conservative, a dove-gray cardigan, small pearl earrings, no excess of anything. She looked like a woman who had put considerable thought into what a reasonable person looked like. "Maggie," Gerald said. I stood at the edge of the porch and I looked at them both. And I said nothing. "We were hoping we could talk," he continued. "Just talk. No lawyers. No—" He stopped, started again. "I know I owe you a conversation. A real one. I know that. And I know I've handled things badly." He paused. More than badly. We both felt, Diane said, stepping in smoothly, that a direct conversation would be more productive than all of this. Paperwork, intermediaries. We thought if we could just sit down together, like adults, we could find a way through this that doesn't have to destroy everyone. I looked at her pearl earrings. I thought about the fact that she had called my phone and told me to consider the consequences for my grandchildren. Come in, I said. I saw the flicker of surprise they tried not to show. They had expected resistance at the door. They had not expected to be invited inside. That surprise told me everything I needed to know about their actual confidence in this plan. I brought them into the living room. I did not offer them coffee. I sat in the armchair that had been mine for 30 years, and I let them take the sofa, and I looked at them across the room, and I waited. Gerald began with a speech I suspected he had rehearsed. He was sorry. He had been lost, had been struggling in ways he hadn't known how to articulate, had made decisions that he understood now, with clarity, were wrong. He was not asking me to forgive him. He was only asking me to consider. He was very careful with this word consider, whether what we were now embarked upon was truly necessary. The federal involvement, the investigation. He was a grandfather. He was thinking of the children, of Karen and Thomas, of how this would land on them publicly, on their careers, on their families. I watched his face as he spoke. 38 years of reading that face. Then Diane took over, and she was smoother, much smoother. She spoke about complexity, about long marriages, about the ways people change, about how the legal system was a blunt instrument for what were fundamentally human problems. She said, and she said it kindly, in the voice of someone delivering wisdom, that pursuing this case would not give me back what I had lost, that no verdict, no sentence would undo the years, that at my age, the energy required, the exposure, the stress, could not possibly be worth it. At my age, there it was. I had been waiting for it, and there it was, wrapped in cashmere and pearl earrings. Let me make sure I understand, I said. My voice was very even. I had been practicing this evenness for weeks, without quite knowing it. You are asking me, in my own living room, to stop cooperating with a federal investigation into fraud that robbed me of $400,000 and caused my children to grieve a death that never happened, because it might be stressful for me. At my age. Gerald's jaw tightened. Maggie, I'm also hearing, I continued, that you're concerned about the effect on Karen and Thomas. That's interesting. Were you concerned about them in February when you made them stand at a graveside? Were you concerned about my granddaughter, Lily, who had nightmares for 2 months after your funeral? She's 8, Gerald. She had nightmares. The room was very quiet. Diane tried once more. She had clearly decided, in the absence of the reasonable approach, to try something with more edge. Margaret, she said, I want to be honest with you. What you're doing, the way you're going about this, it's going to be examined too. Your finances, your receipt of the insurance payment, your choices since February. These investigations aren't one-directional. People who think they're in a straightforward position often find out they're not. It was a threat, dressed as candor, but a threat. I stood up. That surprised them, too. I'd like you to leave my house now, I said. Both of you. If you contact me again, in person, by phone, through any intermediary, I will report it immediately to Agent Horton, and I will add it to the record. Do you understand me? Gerald looked at me for a long moment. He looked at me the way I imagine you look at a place you thought you knew well, and are realizing too late that you never understood at all. They left. I stood in the living room after their car had gone, and I let myself feel what I actually felt, which was fear. Genuine, physical fear, a cold unease that settled in my chest and did not go away immediately. What Diane had said about the investigation being too directional had found a target in me, had lodged in the place where my doubts lived. What if they tried to complicate things? What if they found a way to make me look complicit? What if? But then I thought of 8-year-old Lily and her nightmares. And the fear didn't disappear, but it changed. It compressed, hardened, became something that was not comfortable, but was useful. A whetstone. I called Agent Horton that evening and reported the visit in full detail. When I went to bed that night, I was more resolved than I had been at any point since that parking lot in August. The indictment came in November. Robert Delaney called me on a Tuesday morning, and I could hear in his voice, carefully controlled, professionally measured, something that I recognized as satisfaction. Gerald Calloway has been indicted on 4 counts, he said. Insurance fraud, wire fraud, identity fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Diane Mercer has been indicted as a co-conspirator. The FBI has also referred the case to the IRS, based on irregularities in the financial records they uncovered. I was sitting at the kitchen table. Through the window, the oak tree had lost most of its leaves. "When will it go to trial?" I asked. "Barring delays. Spring." "But Margaret, I want to prepare you. The prosecution will want you as a witness. You will sit in that courtroom and testify, and Craig Sutton, or whoever they've retained for criminal defense, will attempt to cross-examine you. They will be looking for anything that makes you seem unstable, vindictive, or unreliable." "Let them look," I said. The months between the indictment and the trial were strange and slow and populated with an enormous amount of paper. There were depositions, meetings with the federal prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Assistant U.S. Attorney Janelle Carter, preparation sessions with Robert that sometimes lasted 3 hours. Karen flew down twice. Thomas came with his wife and stayed for a week in March, sleeping in the same guest bedroom where Karen had slept in the February after the funeral, and somehow the symmetry of that, the house absorbing grief and resolve in the same rooms, steadied me. Diane and Gerald had retained a criminal defense attorney named Frank Aldrich, who had a reputation for aggressive cross-examination and a willingness to attack the character and memory of opposing witnesses. I knew this going in. Janelle Carter had told me directly, "He will try to make you seem like a grieving widow who is confused or a vindictive woman who is exaggerating. You are neither of those things. You know that. I need you to project that from the witness stand." The trial began in April. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined from television, and more fluorescent, and the smell of it, institutional, faintly warm, paper and old upholstery, was nothing like the solemnity I had expected. I sat in the gallery on the first day, watching. Gerald sat at the defense table in a dark suit. He had aged since August. He did not look at me. Diane sat at the same table, near Aldrich, and she looked at me once. A long, direct look that I met without expression and held until she looked away. The prosecution's opening was methodical and factual. Janelle Carter was not theatrical. She presented the case the way you would explain a mathematical proof, step by step, each piece fitting precisely to the next. The timing of Gerald's life insurance purchase. 18 months before the faked death, after a notable increase in his relationship with Diane. The collaboration with a corrupt medical examiner who had since lost his license. The fraudulent death certificate. The wire transfers that had moved money between accounts in the weeks before the staged heart attack. The rental of the Frisco house, 3 months before Gerald's death, in Diane's name. Aldrich's opening was louder, faster, more aggressive. He used the word confusion 7 times. He suggested that grief could distort memory, that an older woman's certainty, however sincere, was not necessarily reliable. He said the word widow in a tone that was meant to convey fragility. I sat in the gallery and thought, all right then, your turn. I took the stand on the 3rd day. Janelle Carter's direct examination was careful and deliberate. She walked me through the 38 years, the marriage, the signs I had missed, and the signs I had not. She asked about the parking lot in August, and I described it precisely in the plain, factual language I had rehearsed, without embellishment and without tears. She asked about the Sunday visit to my living room, the threat that the investigation would not be one-directional. She asked about my granddaughter Lily's nightmares. I described them, and I watched 2 members of the jury lean forward. Then Aldrich stood up. He was a large man, deliberately large in his bearing, the kind of advocate who uses physical presence as an instrument. He began with a voice that was almost friendly, not warm, but the performance of warmth, a studied pleasantness that I recognized immediately as the same register Diane had used at my door in her pearl earrings. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "you're certain about what you saw in that parking lot?" "Completely certain," I said. "You hadn't been sleeping well. You'd been grieving for 6 months." "I sleep fine," I said. "I've always slept fine." A flicker. He adjusted. "The man you saw, you didn't approach him immediately, did you? You followed him through the store." "I did." "And your heart was racing. You were in shock." "My heart was behaving normally," I said. "I was surprised, not incapacitated." He tried a different angle. He suggested that the therapy I'd undergone after Gerald's death, 2 months of grief counseling, which my medical records confirmed, indicated emotional fragility. I explained calmly that seeking help when one is grieving is not evidence of instability. It is evidence of good sense. He suggested that the insurance money I had received and spent constituted a kind of complicity, a willingness to benefit from the fraud. Janelle Carter objected, and the judge sustained, but I answered anyway, clearly, before she could stop me. I spent that money believing my husband was dead. The moment I discovered he was not, I reported it. Benefiting from a fraud you didn't know was a fraud is not the same thing as participating in it. I'd expect a lawyer to know the difference. There was a sound in the courtroom. Not laughter. Something quieter. The jury was watching me with attention that felt different from the attention they had paid before. Aldrich's pace had changed. He was no longer moving with the unhurried confidence of his opening. He went back to his notes. He asked me 3 more questions, each one smaller and more cautious than the last, and then he sat down. In the gallery, I could see Dorothy, who had come to support me. She gave me a single nod. I stepped down from the stand and walked back to my seat, and I did not look at Gerald. But he looked at me. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. I spent those hours in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the courthouse with Karen, Thomas, and Dorothy. We drank too much coffee and spoke very little about the case. Karen told a long, funny story about something that had happened at her son's school play. Thomas and Dorothy discovered a shared opinion about a particular kind of gardening and talked about it with an intensity that under ordinary circumstances would have struck me as peculiar. I was grateful for all of it, for the noise, for the ordinary human persistence of conversation, for the way people who love you will talk about school plays and roses to keep you in the present tense. My phone rang at 3:47 in the afternoon. I stepped outside to take the call. When I came back in, I sat down, and Karen looked at me and I said, "Guilty. All 4 counts." The sound Thomas made was involuntary. Karen put both hands over her mouth. Dorothy reached across the table and put her hand over mine and didn't say anything. I sat there for a moment, and let it be real. The sentencing hearing was 6 weeks later. Under federal guidelines, Gerald faced a significant term. The 4 counts, the scale of the fraud, the elaborate and premeditated nature of the scheme, and the existence of a co-conspirator all weighed heavily. Diane had attempted, during the trial, to position herself as a woman who had been deceived by Gerald, who had not understood the full extent of what she was participating in. The financial records told a different story. There were transfers she had authorized, communications she had initiated, the lease on the Frisco house in her name signed 4 months before the staged death. Judge Sandra Weatherly sentenced Gerald to 9 years in federal prison. Diane Mercer received 5 years. Craig Sutton had negotiated nothing. Frank Aldrich's appeals to Gerald's age, his lack of prior criminal record, his charitable history, had moved the judge not at all. I watched Judge Weatherly's face as she read the sentence, and what I saw there was not indifference, but a kind of precise moral attention, the face of someone who has weighed the facts and arrived at their correct value. Gerald turned and looked at me as they led him out. I had thought about this moment. I had imagined, in the small hours of many nights over the past months, what I would feel when it came. I had imagined rage, or grief, or triumph, something large and definitive. What I actually felt was much quieter. It was a recognition, a closing. 38 years of a life, some of which had been real and some of which had not, arriving at their actual end. I looked back at him. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I simply looked the way you look at something you are setting down after carrying it for a very long time. Then the door closed, and he was gone. The insurance company had already begun proceedings to recover the fraudulent payment. Because I had cooperated fully and reported the fraud the moment I discovered it, my legal exposure was minimal. Robert Delaney had ensured that. The house was mine outright. We had paid off the mortgage years ago. The remaining insurance money in my account was being held pending the civil recovery proceedings, but Robert was confident that my good faith status would be recognized. There were other details, practical ones, the kind that arrive after the large things are settled. The finalization of legal documents, the dissolution of the marriage under circumstances that required no contest from me, the quiet, bureaucratic work of untangling a shared life from a fraudulent one. Karen helped with most of it. Thomas handled the financial questions that required more patience than I had in those weeks. But one afternoon, in the early days of summer, I sat alone at my kitchen table in the quiet house and did something I had not done since February of the previous year. I made myself a proper cup of tea, not the sleep tea, the good tea, the expensive kind I saved for ordinary pleasures, and I carried it out to the backyard and I sat down under the oak tree. The tree was green, full summer green, extravagant and alive, rustling with a small wind. I sat there for a long time. I thought about Gerald planting that tree the summer Karen was born, 41 years ago, young and hopeful, and probably already complicated in ways I had not yet learned to see. I thought about the years beneath it. I thought about what survives betrayal, what you keep, and what you are forced to let go. I thought, I am still here. And then I drank my tea in the green shade of a summer afternoon, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt no weight at all. The first year after the trial was the year I learned what peace actually felt like. I had thought I knew. In 38 years of marriage, there had been good years. Contentment, warmth, comfortable rhythms. But much of what I had called peace had been the absence of disturbance, which is a different thing. True peace has a quality of fullness. It is the sense that the life you are living is genuinely, unambiguously yours. In September, I did something I had talked about for 20 years and never done. I took a watercolor class. I was enthusiastically bad at it for the first 2 months, and then merely mediocre, and I loved every minute. I painted the oak tree 4 times. I framed the fourth one and hung it in the kitchen. Dorothy and I formalized our Thursday evenings. A book a month, a growing group. By spring, 7 women met weekly, talking about books, gardens, grandchildren, and the particular texture of lives that have survived difficulty and come out the other side. Lily was 9 now, with a fierce interest in birds that had become my own. We bought matching field guides and argued in whispers about warblers on the porch. Thomas and his wife came for Thanksgiving, Christmas, and a random Thursday in March just because they wanted to. I drove to New Mexico with Dorothy and walked among the red rocks at sunrise, feeling very small and very alive. I repainted the bedroom a deep, warm blue, chosen with no consultation, no compromise. I loved it completely. This was my life. It was considerably more than enough. As for Gerald and Diane, Gerald was not adapting well to federal prison. Charm is not a useful currency there. He had developed real health problems. He was, by all accounts, a diminished man. Diane was released to find everything dismantled. Her real estate license had been revoked, her savings largely seized. She moved to a city where she knew no one and started over with nothing she hadn't earned the hard way. I thought about her sometimes. The yellow blouse, the pearl earrings, the careful performance of reasonableness, and felt not triumph, but a quiet clarity. She had wanted a life and chosen the worst possible method of building one. The currency she'd used was someone else's suffering, and it had not held its value. I had lived honestly. It had cost me more than I felt I could afford. But what I had arrived at, this kitchen, this tree, this life that was unambiguously mine, had been purchased fair and square, and it was worth every cent. So that is my story. I am 68 years old, sitting in my kitchen with good tea, morning light, and a half-finished watercolor of a warbler. The oak tree is visible through the window, simply and enormously itself. What did I learn? That being underestimated is an advantage if you understand it correctly. That honesty is not passive. It is a choice you make again and again under pressure. That the truth doesn't need protecting. You only have to tell it. A life cracked open at its center can be rebuilt into something real and entirely your own. What would you have done if this story moved you? Leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs it, and stay for more. Thank you for listening. My 78-year-old husband secretly transferred money to his daughter from his first marriage for 20 years. I said nothing. I just called his first wife. She said, "What daughter? We never had children." When I found out where my husband was really sending money all these years. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Callahan, and I am 74 years old. I want to tell you a story that took me 20 years to fully understand, and only 3 months to act on once I finally did. Howard and I met at a church fundraiser in Tucson in the spring of 1998. He was 62, recently retired from a career in commercial real estate, and he had the kind of steady, quiet confidence that I'd stopped expecting to find at my age. I was 54, a widow of 7 years, with 2 grown children of my own, and a small house on Mesquite Lane that felt too large for one person. We were introduced by mutual friends, and within a year we were married. It was, for a long time, genuinely good. Howard had been married before. He told me about it early. A brief first marriage in his 30s, no children, an amicable divorce. The woman's name was Patricia, and she lived somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. Howard spoke of her without bitterness and without particular warmth, the way a person might mention a neighborhood they used to live in. I had no reason to ask more questions. I was not a jealous woman. I believed him. We built a life together in that house on Mesquite Lane. We traveled when we could. We attended the same church. We argued about the thermostat and agreed about almost everything else. My children liked Howard, his 2 grown sons from a middle marriage. Yes, there had been a second marriage, which I knew about, visited for holidays and treated me with warmth. We were, to every outward appearance, a settled and contented couple. The first time I noticed something strange was in the autumn of 2004. I had gone to get something from Howard's desk in the study. A stapler, I think, or a pen, when I found a bank statement partially tucked under a file folder. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't the type. But the statement was open, face up, and a number caught my eye. A recurring transfer of $400 sent monthly to an account I didn't recognize. The memo line said simply LM. I remembered it, but I said nothing. Howard was a careful man with our finances, generous to a fault with his sons, and occasionally with charities he cared about. I told myself it was probably something I simply hadn't been told about. A nephew, a godchild, an old obligation. Married people don't owe each other itemized explanations for every dollar. I believed that then. I believe it less now. But the years passed, and the small strangeness of it faded. What didn't fade was the pattern. There were phone calls he took outside. Not frequently. Perhaps once a month, sometimes less. Howard would excuse himself from the living room, step onto the back porch, and speak quietly for 5 or 10 minutes. When he came back, he was always slightly more closed off than before, the way a door that's been opened a crack swings back to nearly shut. I noticed. I said nothing. There were moments when he seemed worried in a way he couldn't explain, a heaviness that came and went without obvious cause. I asked once, in 2011, whether everything was all right, whether there was something financial troubling him. He said he was fine. He looked at me steadily and said he was fine. And because I loved him, and because I had no evidence of anything, I believed him. It was in March of 2022 that I finally found something I could not reason away. I was organizing papers after our accountant suggested we update our estate planning documents. Howard was at a dental appointment. I was going through a filing cabinet, with full right to do so since our finances had always been nominally shared. And I found not one bank statement, but 11 of them, spanning the past 2 years, tucked inside a manila folder labeled Insurance Miscellaneous. The monthly transfers had grown. They were now $900 per month. Still to the same account. Still marked LM. I did the arithmetic slowly, sitting at the desk in the study, with the afternoon light coming through the blinds. If the transfers had averaged even $500 per month over 20 years, a conservative guess, that was $120,000. Gone to an account with 2 initials I didn't recognize. I put the statements back exactly as I had found them. I went to the kitchen and made a cup of tea I didn't drink, and then I picked up my phone and did something I had thought about doing, idly, more than once over the years, but never had. I searched for Patricia Howard's phone number. It took me 2 days to find her. She was still in Oregon, remarried with a different last name, but the town was right. And a mutual acquaintance, one of those tenuous social threads that survive decades without being pulled, gave me a number. I called her on a Tuesday afternoon. I introduced myself. Patricia was civil, a little surprised, and after a moment, curious. We spoke for perhaps 15 minutes, working around the edges of why I might be calling. Then I asked, as carefully as I could, whether she knew if Howard had a daughter. A child from before their marriage, perhaps, or from an affair. Patricia went quiet for a moment. Howard and I didn't have children, she said. We tried and it didn't happen. That was actually part of why things fell apart. Why do you ask? He's been sending money, I said, every month for as long as I can remember, to someone with the initials LM. Another silence. Dorothy, Patricia said, and her voice had shifted into something careful and kind, the way a voice shifts when it is about to deliver news it would rather not. Howard didn't have any children when I knew him, none that I ever heard of, but LM. I don't know who that is. I'm sorry. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat with the phone in my lap for a very long time. Who was LM? And where had $120,000 of our money gone? There is a particular kind of stillness that comes after a shock. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind where the mind is running very fast behind a face that has gone very quiet. That was how I spent the next 4 days. I did not confront Howard. Not yet. I had learned something in my 72 years about the difference between having a question and having an answer, and I was not willing to ask the question until I was prepared for every possible answer. Howard was a careful man. If I came to him with suspicion and no evidence, he would find a way to explain things away, and I would be left with nothing but the damage of having accused him. So I went back to the files. I did it methodically, over 3 days, while Howard was at his golf club or running errands or watching the evening news in the living room 10 feet away from where I sat at the desk in the study with the door open, so he would hear nothing unusual in the silence. I went through every bank statement I could find, going back as far as our joint accounts extended. 12 years in the filing cabinet, another 3 years on the computer in scanned PDFs that Howard had organized but apparently not hidden. The transfers were there every month without exception. What varied was the amount. In the early years of our marriage, 2000, 2001, 2002, the transfers were small, 200, sometimes 250. By 2006, they had risen to 400. By 2012, 600. The most recent ones, the $900 monthly transfers I had found in the insurance misgears folder, had begun in 2019. The account number they were sent to was the same across all of it. The memo line changed occasionally, sometimes LM, sometimes simply blank. Once or twice the word loan in Howard's neat handwriting. I added it up on a legal pad, year by year. It took me an hour. The total across 22 years of marriage was $147,000, give or take. The number sat on the paper, and I stared at it for a long time. $147,000. Sent secretly in small enough increments that no single transfer would raise an alarm to an account I had never been told about. Not once in 22 years of marriage had Howard mentioned this. Not once had he said, "There is someone I help financially. Here is who they are. Here is why." Not once. Was I afraid? Yes. I was afraid of what the answer might be, because by that point, I had moved past the possibility of a godchild, or a charity, or an old loan. The amounts were too high, too consistent, too deliberately obscured. This was not generosity. This was something else. Something Howard had decided 20 years ago that I must never know. I thought about what it could be. A child, after all. But Patricia had said there was none. An affair, current or past, with someone who had leverage over him? A business partner from years ago? Some old debt that had never been resolved? The initials LM told me almost nothing. A woman's name, a man's. A company. I didn't know. What I knew was this. I was 72 years old. I had contributed to this household for 22 years, and $147,000 of our shared resources had been sent somewhere I was not permitted to know about. And if I did nothing, it would continue. The transfers were still happening. $900 every month to LM. I called my daughter, Susan, who lives in Phoenix and works as a paralegal. I did not tell her everything, not yet. But I told her I needed to ask her about financial privacy in a marriage and whether a spouse had the right to investigate a joint account. Mom, she said after a pause, what's going on? I'm not sure yet, I said. That's what I'm trying to find out. Susan told me to call a family law attorney before I did anything else. She gave me the name of someone her firm occasionally worked with, a woman named Elaine Marsh, who had a quiet, no-nonsense reputation and an office in downtown Tucson. Susan said, document everything first, then make the call. So I documented. I photographed every statement with my phone. I wrote out the timeline on the legal pad in a handwriting small enough to fit on 4 pages. I added up the numbers twice to be sure. And then I went to the kitchen and made another cup of tea. And this time I drank it. I had a plan. It was a small plan, and I was frightened of where it might lead. But I was more frightened of doing nothing, of sitting in this house for the rest of my life with a question I was never allowed to ask. I had given 22 years to this marriage. I had given it honestly. Whatever Howard had been doing with that money, I deserved to know. The next morning, I called Elaine Marsh's office and made an appointment. Elaine Marsh's office was on the 4th floor of a glass and limestone building on Congress Street, 3 blocks from the courthouse. I had driven past it dozens of times over the years without ever expecting to go inside. The waiting room was calm and unadorned. A few chairs, a side table with a water pitcher, a potted plant that looked as though it was genuinely thriving. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap and reminded myself that I was not doing anything wrong. Elaine Marsh was perhaps 55, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of direct attention that makes a person feel they are being heard rather than assessed. I spread my 4 pages of notes and my photographs of the bank statements on her desk, and I walked her through everything. She listened without interrupting, made a few brief notes, and then leaned back in her chair. This is marital property, she said. In Arizona, assets accumulated during a marriage are community property. That means these transfers, every dollar of them, came from community property, and they were made without your knowledge or consent. That's significant. What does significant mean in practical terms? I asked. It means you have standing to request a full accounting, she said. And depending on what we find on the other end of that account, it may mean more than that. She looked at her notes. LM. Do you have any idea who that might be? I told her I didn't. I told her about my conversation with Patricia. Elaine wrote the initials down and circled them. We can subpoena those bank records, she said, if this goes to a formal proceeding. But before that, there are quieter ways to learn more. I'd suggest a private investigator, someone who can trace the account and the recipient without alerting your husband that you're looking. I had never hired a private investigator in my life. The phrase had always struck me as belonging to detective novels and television dramas. But I sat in that chair on the 4th floor of a building on Congress Street, and I said, all right, who do you recommend? His name was Daniel Reyes. He was methodical, soft-spoken, and had spent 17 years working financial fraud cases before going private. I met him the following week. He asked me a series of precise questions, took copies of my documentation, and told me he would need 2 to 3 weeks. It was during those 3 weeks that something shifted in the house. I am not sure how it happened. I had been careful, meticulous, I thought. I had not changed my behavior, had not moved any papers, had not spoken to anyone in Howard's circle. But Howard began to watch me differently, not with suspicion exactly. He was too controlled for that, but with a new attentiveness, the way a person pays closer attention to a door they've started to wonder about. He asked me one evening at dinner whether I had called anyone recently about financial matters. I said I had spoken to our accountant about updating our wills, which was true, and which was the cover I had used for my initial search through the filing cabinet. Howard nodded and said nothing more, and I watched his face very carefully. There was something there, a flicker. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon when I was returning home from the grocery store, I saw a car parked across the street from our house that I didn't recognize, a dark blue sedan with an out-of-state plate. It was gone when I came outside an hour later. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps something. 3 weeks after I first met with Daniel Reyes, he called me and asked to meet at a coffee shop near his office. I drove there alone, without telling anyone where I was going. He had a folder with him. He set it on the table between us and opened it. The account the money had been sent to for 22 years belonged to a woman named Lorraine Mercer. She was 61 years old. She lived in Scottsdale, Arizona, 40 minutes from our house in Tucson. She had no formal employment on record for the past 15 years, no business registered in her name, no apparent source of income beyond what appeared to be private transfers from multiple sources. She had also, Daniel told me, a documented prior relationship with Howard that predated our marriage. She had been his secretary in the early 1990s when Howard ran his commercial real estate office. There were photographs in the folder, printed from old digital files Daniel had sourced from public records and social media, of Howard and Lorraine at what appeared to be a company event, standing close together, his hand at the small of her back. "This is not a daughter," I said. "No," Daniel said. "It's not." I looked at the photographs for a long time. Then I closed the folder and put it in my handbag. I drove home. Howard was in the living room reading the newspaper. I said good evening. I made dinner. I sat across from him at the table we had shared for 22 years, and I did not show, on my face, a single thing that I was feeling. Because now I knew. The following Monday, I returned to Elaine Marsh's office with Daniel's folder. We spent 2 hours going through every piece of documentation. By the end of that meeting, Elaine had enough to file a formal complaint under Arizona community property law and request a full forensic accounting of our joint finances. She was clear with me about what would happen next. Howard would be served with notice. He would know. "Are you ready for that?" Elaine asked. "No," I said, "but I'm going to do it anyway." The papers were served on a Thursday afternoon. I was not home when it happened. I had, on Elaine's advice, packed a small bag the night before and driven to Susan's apartment in Phoenix. I sat in Susan's living room and watched the afternoon light move across her floor and waited for my phone to ring. It rang at 4:17. Howard's voice was controlled. He was always controlled. But underneath the control, there was something I had never heard from him before. A kind of cold fury, tightly compressed. "Dorothy, what is this?" "It's a legal notice," I said. "Elaine Marsh will be in touch with your attorney." "You hired a lawyer without telling me." "You sent $147,000 to Lorraine Mercer without telling me," I said. "So I suppose we've both been doing things without telling each other." A silence, long enough that I wondered if he had hung up. "That money is a private matter," he said finally. "It has nothing to do with our marriage." "Howard," I said, "it is our money, not your money, our money, and that makes it very much to do with our marriage." He hung up. I thought that would be the end of the first conversation. It was not. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again, and the number on the screen was not Howard's. It was a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a woman's voice said, "Dorothy, this is Lorraine Mercer. I think we need to talk." My hand tightened on the phone. "I don't think we do," I said. "You're making a mistake," she said. Her voice was smoother than I had expected. Practiced, I thought. The voice of someone who had done this before, talked her way through difficult conversations. "Howard has obligations to me that predate your marriage. You don't understand the situation." I understand that $900 a month has been leaving my household for years, I said. I understand it went to you. That's the part that matters legally. If you pursue this, she said, and her voice dropped, there are things I know about Howard that would be very damaging. To him, to you, to your children. I recognized what she was doing. I had expected something like this, though I had not known its precise shape. I took a breath. If you have information you believe is legally relevant, I said, you're welcome to provide it to Elaine Marsh. She's very thorough. And then I hung up. That evening, I called Elaine and reported the conversation in full. She was unsurprised. Classic pressure tactic, she said. She's frightened. Let her be. She advised me to save all records of contact from either Howard or Lorraine and to respond to nothing further without Elaine's knowledge. Howard called twice more that week, once through his attorney and once personally, the latter in a quieter, more conciliatory tone that I recognized as strategy. He said he wanted to explain. He said it was complicated. He said I had never had reason to distrust him. I listened. I said I would have my attorney be in touch, and I ended the call. By the second week, the calls had stopped. Elaine told me that Howard's attorney had signaled a willingness to discuss settlement. It was early, far too early for me to consider it, but the silence was itself a kind of retreat. On the Saturday of that second week, Susan drove me to Sedona. We stayed in a small inn with a porch that looked out toward the Red Rocks, and we sat outside in the evenings with cups of tea and talked about things that had nothing to do with lawyers or bank statements or Lorraine Mercer. I ate well. I slept. I let the red landscape be large and quiet and indifferent in the way that landscape, at its best, can be. I needed 3 days. I took them. I came back from Sedona on a Tuesday morning, rested in a way I had not been in weeks. The house felt different to return to, quieter, and charged in some way I can't precisely describe, as though it were waiting. Howard had, per our arrangement through the attorneys, moved temporarily to a hotel near the university. His reading chair was empty. The newspaper he usually left folded on the side table was not there. The house was mine alone, for the first time in 22 years, and I found I was not unhappy in it. 2 days after I returned, a letter arrived. Not from Lorraine's attorney, from Lorraine herself, handwritten on expensive cream stationery. I set it on the kitchen counter and read it twice before I allowed myself to react. The letter was skillfully written, I will grant her that. It did not threaten. It appealed. It described, in careful, measured language, a relationship with Howard that had begun before I had ever appeared in his life. A relationship she characterized as the central fact of her existence, interrupted but never truly ended. She wrote about what she called Howard's sense of duty toward her. She suggested that I, as a woman of a certain age, could surely understand the complexity of long attachments, the ways in which love does not follow neat legal lines. Near the end, she offered me something. If I were to withdraw the legal action, she wrote, she would be willing to formalize the arrangement, to accept a fixed final sum from Howard and end the monthly transfers permanently. She framed this as a resolution that would spare everyone embarrassment. She used the word generous in describing her offer. She used the word dignity in describing what she was preserving. I read it a second time. I set it down. I took a walk around the block. Was there a part of me that felt the pull of it? I would be dishonest if I said no. What Lorraine was offering was the end of conflict, the quick resolution that would let me close the folder and return to the quieter life I had lived before I found those bank statements. I am old enough to know how seductive the absence of conflict can be, especially when you are tired and frightened and not entirely certain how much more disruption your heart can hold. But I also knew something that Lorraine's carefully worded letter did not account for. I was not tired anymore. I had slept in Sedona. I had come home. I had eaten breakfast that morning and stood at my kitchen window, watching the desert light move across the yard, and felt, with a clarity that surprised me, that I was not willing to let this go. $147,000. 22 years, and not a single word. I put the letter in an envelope, labeled it clearly, and drove it to Elaine's office. That same week, I did something I had been postponing. I called my friend Margaret Hoover, who had been my closest friend for 30 years, and who knew me better than almost anyone. I asked her to have lunch with me, and I told her everything. I told her about the bank statements. I told her about Daniel's folder and Lorraine Mercer's photographs. I told her about the phone call and the letter. I told her about the total, $147,000. I watched Margaret's face move through several expressions: shock, then something that looked like anger on my behalf, then a steadying. "What do you need?" she asked. "I need someone to know," I said. "And I need someone to tell me I'm not being unreasonable." "Dorothy Ann Callahan," Margaret said, "you are the most reasonable woman I know, and you are doing exactly the right thing. I am not someone who cries easily. I cried then, briefly, in a booth at a restaurant on Speedway Boulevard, and Margaret sat across from me and did not say anything unhelpful. I also called my son Robert, who lives in Denver. Robert is more measured than Susan, more given to weighing all sides. But when I laid out the facts, he was quiet for a long moment and then said, "Mom, we're with you. Whatever you need." Susan had already said as much. My children knew, my best friend knew, I was no longer carrying this alone. And Lorraine, she was watching, I felt sure of it, waiting to see if her letter had done its work, waiting for me to flinch. I did not flinch. It was a Thursday evening in late October when Howard called and asked if he could come to the house. Not through his attorney, personally. He said he wanted to talk, not as adversaries, but as two people who had shared 22 years. He said he missed the house. His voice, over the phone, sounded diminished in a way I had not heard before. Smaller than it had been that first angry call, thinner, older. I consulted Elaine. She advised caution, pointed out that anything said outside the legal process could be used in complicated ways, and reminded me that I was under no obligation. But she left the decision to me. I thought about it for 24 hours. Then I told Howard he could come, on a Saturday afternoon, for 1 hour. He arrived at 2 o'clock. He was dressed carefully, navy blazer, the gray slacks I had always liked on him. And he looked old to me in a way he had not before, which may have been his intention, or may simply have been true. He sat in the living room in his usual chair and folded his hands in the familiar way. And for a moment, I felt the full weight of 22 years, and it was almost unbearable. The house was very quiet around us. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked once and went silent. He began with an apology. Not a complete one. Howard had never done anything completely in his life. But the outline of an apology, the shape of regret. He said he should have told me about Lorraine years ago. He said it had begun before we met, that it was a complicated and unresolved attachment that he had not known how to end. He said the money was never about love. It was obligation, guilt, a debt he felt he owed her for reasons he couldn't fully explain. He chose his words the way a careful man lays down stepping stones, precisely, one at a time, testing each for weight before committing to the next. "I never stopped loving you, Dorothy," he said. He said it quietly, and he looked at me directly when he said it. I recognized this too. It was not dishonest exactly. I believed he meant it, or had convinced himself he meant it. But it was a move, the apology, the diminishment, the declaration of love. These were instruments of a negotiation, and the negotiation was, let this go. I had spent 22 years in a house with a careful man, and I knew how careful men negotiate. They make you feel seen so that you will stop looking. Then Lorraine's name came up. He had spoken to her, he said, and he relayed what was, in essence, an elaborated version of her letter. A final settlement, a clean end, no court proceedings, no public record. He said it would be better for my children, who wouldn't want their mother's marriage examined in court documents. He said it would be better for me. He said the word dignity again, just as Lorraine had used it in her letter, and that repetition, that coordinated repetition, told me something important about how much the two of them had spoken, and how carefully they had prepared this visit. Better for me, I repeated. Cleaner, he said. Quieter. I looked at him across the living room in the afternoon light that came through the shutters we had chosen together at a hardware store in 2003, and I thought, you have been doing this for 22 years. You have sat across from me, in this room, at this table, and let me believe something that was not true. And now you are asking me to choose, again, the version of my life that is more convenient for you. Howard, I said, my attorney will be in touch with yours. He was still for a moment, then something in his face shifted. The controlled exterior cracked just slightly, and beneath it I saw, briefly, something harder and less kind. You're going to regret this, he said. It was quiet, but it was unmistakable. He let it sit between us for 3 or 4 seconds, long enough to make sure I had understood it. And then he stood, straightened his blazer, and walked to the door with the measured step of a man who has decided he has said enough. I think you should go now, I said, though he was already going. He went. I stood at the kitchen window and watched his car pull away from the curb, and my hands, when I noticed them, were trembling slightly against the counter. I was afraid. I won't pretend otherwise. Howard's parting words had been, underneath their measured delivery, a threat, and threats have weight regardless of how softly they're spoken. What did he mean by regret? A legal maneuver? A disclosure of something about me, real or invented? I did not know, and not knowing was its own particular variety of fear. But fear, I have learned, is not a stop sign. Sometimes it is an arrow. I called Elaine that evening and told her everything. I told her about the coordinated language, the word dignity appearing in both the letter and Howard's conversation. I told her about Howard's parting words. She wrote it down. She said, "Good. That goes in the file. All of it." And I felt, underneath the trembling, something I had not expected. A kind of iron patience, a willingness to keep going that had nothing to do with anger anymore, and everything to do with simply being unwilling to let go of what was mine. I had not come this far. Through the filing cabinet and Daniel's folder and the deposition preparations and Lorraine's letter and this long, careful Saturday afternoon. To stop now, because a man in a navy blazer had looked at me steadily and expected me to flinch. I did not flinch. I made dinner. I read for an hour in the blue-gray study that was not yet blue-gray, but would be. And I went to bed at 9 o'clock and slept without difficulty, which surprised me, and which I took as a sign. The deposition was scheduled for a Monday morning in November. Elaine had prepared me thoroughly. What to expect, how to answer, what not to say unless asked directly. We had rehearsed the key moments twice in her office, with her playing the opposing attorney with a sharpness I found initially startling and then deeply reassuring. By the Friday before the deposition, I felt as ready as I was going to be. It was not the deposition itself that became the decisive moment. It was what happened that Friday morning. Elaine called me at 9 and asked me to come to her office immediately. Her voice was careful in a way that told me something had broken open. Not badly, but significantly, the way a lock sounds when the right key finally turns. I drove to Congress Street and took the elevator to the 4th floor. Daniel Reyes was already there, seated across from Elaine's desk with a second folder open in front of him, slightly thicker than the first. He had, at Elaine's request, conducted a deeper financial investigation into Lorraine Mercer's accounts over the past 3 weeks, tracing not just her receipts, but her expenditure patterns, cross-referencing account activity against publicly available records. What he had found went considerably further than either of us had anticipated. Lorraine Mercer had not been receiving money solely from Howard. The same account that had received Howard's transfers had also received funds from 2 other men, both of a similar age and professional background to Howard, both living in the Tucson and Scottsdale areas. Daniel had traced these through overlapping records, shared financial institutions, and a pattern of timing and amount that became unmistakable once the full picture was assembled. The amounts varied slightly from man to man. The regularity, monthly, consistent, sustained over years, was identical. Lorraine was not, by any legal definition, a blackmailer. There was no direct evidence of explicit written threats, nothing that would easily sustain a criminal charge on those terms. What there was, instead, was a pattern of sustained intimate deception. A woman who had maintained simultaneous long-term financial relationships with multiple men, in each case leveraging old emotional history and personal vulnerability to sustain ongoing payments. In each case, ensuring the men's silence by keeping them convinced that their particular arrangement was unique, personal, and irreplaceable. She had been, in other words, running a kind of invisible enterprise built entirely on the loneliness and shame of careful men who believed they had a secret no one else shared. The other 2 men were named in Daniel's folder. One of them, when approached carefully and discreetly by Daniel, had confirmed the arrangement with a brevity that suggested relief as much as anything else. He had been sending money for 14 years. He thought he was the only one. Howard, it was now clear, had not been secretly supporting a woman he loved in any straightforward sense. He had been, for 22 years, paying to maintain a secret. A secret that Lorraine had originally cultivated and then quietly held in place with the patience and consistency of someone who understood exactly how much men will pay to keep their pasts private. Whether he had ever truly loved her, or had simply been afraid of her from very early on, I could not say with certainty. Perhaps both things were true at once. True at the deposition that Monday was no longer a standard community property proceeding. Elaine had coordinated over the weekend with the attorney of one of the other affected parties, the elderly man whose son had taken the situation very seriously and moved swiftly. Howard arrived with his attorney at 10 o'clock, dressed in a dark suit, looking as controlled as I had ever seen him, his face arranged in the expression of a man who believes he still has the situation in hand. Lorraine arrived separately, 20 minutes late, in a charcoal blazer and pearls, with an attorney I didn't recognize. Younger than I expected, with the slightly tense posture of someone who has been given a difficult brief on short notice. Elaine laid out the full documentation on the conference table without preamble or theatrics. The 22 years of transfers, the forensic account records, Daniel's complete report on the parallel arrangements with the other 2 men, the written confirmation from the second party, and a financial timeline that showed, month by month, the architecture of what Lorraine had built. She presented it in the flat and careful voice of someone who has learned, through long practice, that facts do not need embellishment. They need only to be laid clearly in the light. I watched Lorraine's face as the second folder was opened and Elaine began to read the account numbers aloud. For 22 years, Lorraine had been entirely safe, managing these men in separate silence, relying on their shame and their particular species of attachment, the kind that makes a person pay indefinitely rather than confess, to keep each of them contained. The one variable she had not accounted for was one of the women deciding that her own name and her own share of the money were worth more than the cost of the fight. Lorraine's composure cracked in increments, and it was almost architectural to watch. First, the fixed stillness in her face loosened slightly around the jaw. Then a tightening appeared around her eyes. Then came a whispered exchange with her attorney that lasted 4 minutes and concluded with her attorney touching her arm in the way attorneys touch their clients when the news is not good and there is no softer way to deliver it. Her attorney asked for a recess. Elaine declined, citing the scheduled timeline and the presence of the second party's representative. Lorraine looked at the table. Howard, for his part, had gone the color of old concrete, not ill, not collapsing, simply deflated, structurally, as though something interior had quietly given way. He was looking at the documents in front of him with the expression of a man who has, for the first time in a very long time, run entirely out of room to maneuver. His attorney leaned toward him and said something low. Howard shook his head once, slightly, and did not look up. At the end of the formal session, Lorraine's attorney requested a private conference. We gave them 1 hour in a smaller room down the hall. Elaine and I sat in the conference room and drank water from the pitcher on the table and did not say much. There was nothing much to say. The folder was on the table. The numbers were on the record. Everything that had been hidden for 22 years was now, in the careful language of legal documentation, fully visible. When the hour was up, they came back with a settlement offer. It was not, Elaine told me quietly, the offer of people who believe they have any leverage left. It was the offer of people who want the room to stop looking at them. I sat at that table with my hands folded in my lap and my face composed, and I felt, underneath the composure, something that I can only describe as the opposite of fear. A stillness that was not resignation, but clarity. The clarity of a person who has finally located the true floor of a situation and found it solid under her feet. 22 years. $147,000. And now, at last, the full picture on the table in front of everyone. I listened to the offer in full. I let the silence sit for a moment after Lorraine's attorney finished speaking. Then I looked at Elaine, who gave the smallest of nods. "We'll need that in writing," I said, "by end of business Friday." The settlement was signed 11 days later in Elaine's office, on a Tuesday morning when the sky outside the fourth-floor windows was the particular pale blue of a Tucson November, cloudless, high, indifferent to human arrangements in the most comforting way. Under the agreement, Howard was required to repay to me from his personal assets the full amount determined by the forensic accountant, which came to $163,000 once the accountant had included compound interest on funds withdrawn from a joint investment account over the same period. The original $147,000 I had calculated at the kitchen table with my legal pad and my careful arithmetic had been conservative. The full picture was worse. The repayment was structured to be completed within 18 months, secured against Howard's share in a commercial property he had retained from his real estate years, a strip of land outside of Marana that he had held onto through both his previous marriages, and regarded, I had always sensed, as something privately inviolable. It was no longer inviolable. The settlement also included a full accounting clause. Howard was required to disclose all financial accounts held in his name, individually or jointly, for the entire duration of our marriage. The forensic accountant's review of those accounts found no additional hidden transfers beyond the Lorraine payments, which told me something I had quietly needed to know. The deception had been singular. Extensive and sustained, yes, but not the symptom of a wider hidden life, not the surface of something deeper and more comprehensive. That knowledge did not erase anything, but it clarified the shape of what I was dealing with, and clarity has its own value. The divorce itself was finalized 4 months after the deposition, on a cold, bright morning in February. I drove to the courthouse with Susan, who sat beside me in the waiting area with her hand in mine and did not offer unnecessary words, which is one of the things I have always loved about my daughter. The judge reviewed the settlement agreement, asked me 2 questions in a mild and unhurried voice, and signed the decree. The whole proceeding took 11 minutes. 22 years. 11 minutes. There is something both absurd and clarifying about that ratio, and I have thought about it many times since. I did not cry. I had expected to. Instead, I felt a kind of weightlessness. Not happiness, not quite relief, but the particular sensation of a door closing that has been open too long on a draft. The absence of cold is its own form of warmth. Outside the courthouse, in the February sun that hit the pale limestone of the building at a low winter angle and turned everything briefly golden, Susan squeezed my hand. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I think I am," I said, and I meant it with a completeness I had not felt in a long time. I want to be precise about what I won and what I lost, because I think precision matters here more than comfort. I won the full financial accounting. I won the repayment. I won the truth, which had cost me 22 years of living inside a partial fiction, a fiction that had been, in its better moments, genuinely pleasant, but which I now had, at last and completely and irrevocably, in my possession. I lost a marriage that had been real in its way, not entirely false. The travel was real, and the companionable evenings, and the accumulated texture of a shared life that does not simply dissolve because its foundation was compromised. That loss was genuine, and I did not minimize it, not to myself and not to anyone who asked. But I had not lost my house. I had not lost my children. I had not lost Margaret, or my church, or the desert light through the kitchen window, or the particular pleasure of a morning that belongs entirely to you. And I had not. And this, in the weeks after the decree, came to feel like the most important thing. Lost the sense of myself as a woman who had looked at a hard truth and chosen it over a comfortable lie. In the weeks after the decree, I did 2 things. The first was practical. I met with Claire, my financial planner, and we went through the repayment schedule, the retirement accounts, the investment strategy for the recovered funds. The picture was not bleak. I had been careful with money all my life, and what had been taken was real, but recoverable, and Claire went through it all with the thoroughness and lack of condescension that I had come to expect from her. By the end of that first meeting, I understood my financial position with a clarity I had not had for 22 years, and that clarity itself felt like a form of recovered wealth. The second thing was smaller and private. I drove, one afternoon in late February, out past the city limits to a stretch of desert road I had always loved. A long, straight road that runs between low hills covered in saguaro and palo verde, where the sky feels particularly large and the silence is the kind that has texture to it. I pulled over and got out and stood in the cold, dry air. The saguaros cast long blue shadows in the afternoon sun. A hawk circled something distant and patient. I stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, not thinking about Howard or Lorraine or the conference table or the 11 minutes in the courtroom, just being in the landscape, which was large and honest and asked absolutely nothing of me. Then I got back in the car, turned the heat on low, and drove home along the road I had always loved, through the late afternoon light that turned the desert gold and then amber, and then a deep, quiet red before the sun went down completely. The house on Mesquite Lane was lit from inside when I pulled into the driveway. I had left the kitchen light on. It looked, from the outside, like a house where someone lived well. I sat in the car for a moment and looked at it. Then I went inside. Spring came to Tucson with its particular intensity. The jacaranda trees on my block bloomed purple 2 weeks earlier than usual, and the mornings were warm enough to take coffee out to the back porch by March. I noticed the season in a way I had not in years, the way you notice things when the ongoing low hum of dread has finally gone quiet. I repainted the study. I had always found the color, a deep tan that Howard had chosen in 2005. Oppressive in some way I'd never been able to name. I chose a pale blue-gray, the color of the sky at 7 in the morning when the light is still soft, and I painted it myself over a long weekend with Susan and her daughter helping. It took us 12 hours and we laughed more than I had expected. The room, afterward, was entirely mine. I resumed things I had allowed to go quiet over the years of the marriage. I had been a committed reader before Howard, working my way through the kind of long novels that require weeks of sustained attention, and I had, somewhere in our domestic life, gradually ceded the evenings to his television preferences. Now I read every night, in the blue-gray study, in a chair I had bought for myself at an estate sale in April. I joined a morning walking group through my church. 6 women between 68 and 81 who met at 6:30 at a park 3 blocks from my house and walked for 45 minutes while talking about everything and nothing. I looked forward to those mornings with an unashamed eagerness. Margaret and I had lunch every Thursday. Robert came to visit for a week in May, and we drove up to the White Mountains and hiked a trail that I had last walked in my 40s, and I was slower than I used to be and unbothered by it. Susan and I talked on the phone 3 times a week, and the conversations no longer had that particular undertone of maternal worry that had colored them through the worst months of the proceedings. The repayment from Howard arrived in its first installment in April, deposited directly to an account I had opened in my name alone. I did not spend it immediately. I left it there for 2 months, getting used to the weight of it, before Claire and I discussed where it should go. We decided in the end on a combination of conservative investments and a modest renovation to the back portion of the house that I had been putting off for a decade. The renovation was finished by summer. The contractor said I had good taste. I told him I had always had good taste. As for Howard, I heard through Susan, who had a connection to his elder son, that he had left the hotel after the divorce and moved into a small condo near the university. A compact 2-bedroom in a complex that was, by all accounts, perfectly adequate and entirely cheerless. His sons had taken the news of the proceedings with a kind of pained resignation, neither defending him vigorously nor completely abandoning him. He was, as far as I understood, aging in that condo with reduced finances and reduced standing, and managing, as stubborn people do, to seem fine on the surface. but the commercial property that had been secured against his repayment was eventually sold at a loss to meet a second installment. And I was told, quite recently, that his financial position was considerably diminished. Lorraine Mercer did not fare better. The civil complaint filed by the second man's son went to mediation and then to a judgment. I do not know the exact figure, but I was told it was substantial. Substantial enough that she had, within the year, sold her Scottsdale condo and moved somewhere less expensive. The third man in Daniel's report, who had not initially come forward, retained an attorney of his own after the judgment was publicized in a brief notice in the Arizona Republic. There were, I imagined, further proceedings. I did not follow them closely. I had no appetite for it. What I had an appetite for was my life. My actual life. The morning walks and the long novels and the blue-gray study and the Thursday lunches and the desert outside my kitchen window. I was 73 years old, and I had, after a significant detour, arrived back at myself. There is something I want to say about anger, because people sometimes ask me whether I am still angry. The answer is no. Not because I have forgiven everything, or because I think what was done was acceptable, but because anger, sustained past its useful moment, is a form of residence. It means you are still living in the house of the wrong that was done to you. I chose, at some point in the spring, to move out. I chose my own house instead. What would you have done? If this story moved you or stayed with you, I hope you'll share it. Leave a comment. Tell a friend. These things happen in ordinary houses on ordinary streets, and sometimes knowing they happen and knowing what one person did about it is exactly what someone else needs to hear. Thank you for listening.